explain my background first of all, because you may be wondering. That is the Volkswagen virtually in back of me, although it's actually sitting out in the my driveway. It's a 1991 Volkswagen camper that is wrapped in, as you can see, a series of messages about the importance of voting and making your vote count. And in particular, it was commissioned to publicize a project that Lauren Bann knows well, that I'll say a little bit more about, called Draw the Lines PA, which is our successful attempt to engage thousands of people around the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania around the issue of redistricting reform. So anyway, you're going to have to live with the colorful background for the duration of my talk. I will just say it's a media magnet. We just put out our annual report a little while ago, and every time the Volkswagen, sort of moved, it captured some media attention and is #1 on our list of media mentions, which I suppose maybe makes people think that this is not a serious topic that we're after, but it is. And we have been plowing the grounds of renewing, restoring, reinvigorating our local democracy for a long time in the Philadelphia area and in Pennsylvania. We were founded, the Committee of 70 was founded 117 years ago now. We've got a lot of miles on the tires. And it's a fairly distinctive organization. There's only a few like it in the country. There's a corollary in Chicago and one in New York that were all offspring of, let's just say, the last progressive movement, or maybe the capital P progressive movement, which, as you know, was driven by folks like Teddy Roosevelt and the muckraking journalists of the day and so forth. And essentially, their focus was very local. They were very concerned about the way that the political process and government were working in places like Philadelphia, and then also interested in issues like labor laws and voting reform and child welfare and education. I mean, cities were bursting at the seams. And so organizations like ours were formed by, I think, people of goodwill who were leaders in their community who said, it's our right and our responsibility to do something about this. And that fixing government, which is a continual process, a continuous process, is not self-executing. We've got to step in and do something about it. And one of the early and constant planks in our platform has been the need to protect and improve the voting process. So we didn't come to this lightly or lately. And we can talk some more about the experience of 2020, which drew a lot of attention to Pennsylvania and to Philadelphia, but it was a true test of our organization, and one that we rose to, I think, had a lot of success. And by the way, just to introduce, we have one of our staff members, Lauren Christella, is on the call somewhere. And also we have our own intern, Cassidy Martin, who's a student at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School, who's of Public and International Affairs, who's on the call as well. So, all right, enough of the preamble. Oh, except I'll say one thing, just to satisfy your curiosity. The Committee of 70 and the name it's kind of a curious name. What is it about the name 70? Without going into great detail, I'll just tell you that it's a biblical reference. So I'll leave it up to you and Google to figure that out. But clearly, the people who founded this organization wanted to cloak our work in a sense of higher purpose, which I think is appropriate given how fundamental democracy and local democracy is to this nation. So here's how I'm going to organize my thoughts, and I'll try to take about a half an hour for this tour, and then would love to hear your questions and comments. I like to think in threes. So there are three things I want to talk to you about. One, think of them as pillars of our local democracy. The first is active citizenship. The second is reform. Organizations like ours have productive reform sort of baked into our DNA, and I want to suggest a couple things that are in the works and ought to be pursued that could improve the process for the better. And then finally, just a couple thoughts about the need, and I hope that there's a pendulum swing back to a focus on governing. Sometimes elections get people all sort of whipped up in a frenzy, and we say stuff and do stuff and so forth, but at the end of the day, it's got to be about how we govern ourselves. So first on citizenship, about a year ago, actually with the aid of the Volkswagen, we were all set to launch a major initiative to encourage what we think of as the 5 habits of effective citizenship. And we were calling this the Campaign for Political Reform. We thought, in other words, CPR for democracy. So, which we thought was kind of clever. It became less clever when the pandemic reared its ugly head, and pictures of ERs and defibrillators and so forth. So we decided to not call it CPR for democracy, but we repackaged this under an effort called We Vote, which Lauren Christella actually managed for our shop. Same basic principles, and I'll just sort of tick through them. But this was an attempt in a very consequential election year to get people to think about what it means to be a citizen, to practice active habits of citizenship, one of which was, of course, to vote. So here are these are all research based, and I encourage you to maybe think about putting them to work in your various efforts. 5 habits of effective citizenship. First is voting. Voting is sort of the gateway. It's not the end, it's the beginning. And I always believe that, fundamentally, maybe the best way to get people to vote is to get them to vote, which sounds sort of counterintuitive, but sometimes we get caught up in we need to educate people and we need to tell them all about all the issues that they could possibly want to know. And voting at its most basic is a very simple act. You walk to the booth or you sit down at your kitchen table, fill out the ballot, off it goes. So that's why it's first rather than last. Second, and this is a huge challenge right now, no news to all of you, so to speak, we need to choose our news wisely. We live in a world of just incredible flows of information, social media streams, content coming at you from all sides. It's like trying to think of in an atomic reactor, all the particles that are assaulting us all the time. And it's really important to develop good news consumption habits, not unlike, the old food pyramid that you got taught back in elementary school. And people say, well, what does that mean? There's the most simple habit that you could adopt is to commit to yourself not to forward or share a social media post that you haven't read. And you'd be shocked maybe by how many people don't do that, how many people fail that test. And then there's another corollary to that, which is to ask yourself some critical questions about the source of that social media post, because I'm convinced that if you trust the source, the news itself that you get from that source is more likely to be accurate and instructive. So choose your news wisely. The third is also a tough one, as we live in this, world of tribal politics and hyperpartisanship and so forth. But that's to invite diverse perspectives. It begins by maybe suggesting to yourself that you could be wrong in whatever it is that you're believing or saying to others and so forth. Even more fundamentally, maybe if you just stopped you paused for a second before you said something or tried to convince somebody of something, and use that pause to sort of question yourself. And then, from there, and I suspect, given the work that you all are involved in, you may be you may be leading these kinds of efforts. There's a lot of room for literally people of different political views and political persuasions, and one wearing the red shirt, one wearing the blue shirt, to actually sit down and talk to each other. And if all goes according to plan, this actually might be possible within the next few months, because I know it's a different kind of challenge to do this all virtually, but invite diverse perspectives. I point you, just as an interesting resource, to someone that actually Lauren Christella found, who is on the faculty at University of Delaware, whose name is Danigal Young. She is a associate professor who studies political communication and the use of social media, and how people how that shapes people's political perceptions and political communication. So Danigal Young, invite diverse perspectives. The fourth habit of effective citizenship is to learn how it works. And I think this has particular relevance to the challenge that we're talking about today, which is how to localize and how to become a champion for local democracy. I started out my career as a middle school social studies teacher, trying to figure out ways to get squirmy 12-year and 13-year-olds to sit still and pay attention and learn something. And one thing I realized early on is you have to engage them actively in the kind of things that are around them. So I came up with a unit which was essentially where do things come from and where do they go? So this was everything from like the water supply to, trash disposal to, the desks that we had in the classroom and so forth. And literally like just engaging them in that kind of thought process. And, we had film strips back then, so it was we were a lot more limited in our audio visuals, but just like relative to this, learning how it works locally, like go to a city council meeting or watch it on the stream, by the way, because everything's on a stream these days. Ask yourself if, the park across the street, the nets are gone off the basketball hoops, like whose job is that? And how would you take on as a citizen the seemingly simple job of getting those nets restored? So, this is sort of reminding folks that the government that we pay for, the folks that we vote for, all have something to do with very tangible outcomes and results in our community. So learn how it works, and learn how it works also, of course, applies to the voting process and so forth and so on. And then the fifth habit in the five habits of effective citizenship is to act. And we sort of like to say that none of the other four really count unless you take, the fifth. And of course, voting is an act, but and again, I expect this is part of your work as well, just encouraging folks to find other ways to contribute to the democratic process. We were very successful this past year. And again, my guess is some of you doing this work too, in encouraging people to work at the polls. We had a huge challenge in Philadelphia to fill the close to 8,000 poll workers that we needed to staff the elections. And at a time of pandemic when people weren't comfortable in going out and being with other people and so forth. And we were overwhelmed by the response, and took that opportunity to improve the way poll workers were trained and the kind of materials that they were given to try to demystify the process. But it was really rewarding. And again, Lauren was on point for a lot of this, Lauren Christella. It was really rewarding to see how people responded to this challenge, that finding a small way to contribute to their community and to make this whole arcane election process work was really satisfying and really important. And, again, this is sort of basic behavioral psychology. When you can get people to act, those actions drive their beliefs. So if you can get someone to cross the line and commit to, 10 hours of sitting behind a desk and registering voters, they then have a stake in the way that works, also become, by the way, very effective counterbalancing forces against folks who say that, the elections are rigged or stolen or wrought with fraud or what have you, because literally, I used to say that you should not have the ability to question the election process until you had done some time as an election worker, because then you really have, what the military folks say is ground truth about the election process. Anyway, so that's the 5 habits, and let me just kind of wrap those up into this little bit of a case study that, again, Lauren Band has been a real rock star in, which is this project that we have sponsored for the last 3 years called Draw the Lines PA, which is focused on the evils of gerrymandering. I suspect I don't have to explain that term to those of you on the call. But it says, one way to push back on gerrymandering is to give individual citizens the power and the capacity and the ability to actually draw maps themselves, and to therefore become spokespeople for fair, honest, transparent, non-gerrymandered maps. And that's what we set out to do 3 years ago. We raised some money. We put all of this map drawing in the framework of a competition because people like competitions. And quite remarkably, over the past 3 years, we've had 6,000 people across Pennsylvania, young folks, high school students, college students, old folks, everybody in between, participate in actually drawing maps. And Lauren was one of those, Lauren Band. And in fact, I was thinking about a year ago, she joined me for one of the last in-person things that I did, which was a presentation at the University of Pittsburgh about Draw the Lines. It's been a tremendous success, although the game is not over because we still have yet to draw actual maps here in Pennsylvania. Some of you know the census date has been delayed for a variety of reasons, but we're firmly convinced that because of what we've done, we've engaged 6,000 people in this hands-on exercise of drawing democracy, that we've built a powerful force to stand up and say, you can't do that. You can't get away with the partisan, cul-de-sacs that you draw on these maps to benefit one party or the other. And I mention that just because in a lot of ways it embodies the habits of citizenship that we're trying to promote. Drawthelinespa.org. Maybe Lauren, you can put that in the chat just so folks can see that. By the way, our organization's website is just 70.org, the word 70. So, take a look at that to your heart's content. Okay, so there's the first pillar is citizenship. Second, I want to talk about what I think is a real need for structural reform, or think about changing the rules of the game for the democratic process. And this applies locally as well as nationally. And this is around things like a lot of discussion about voting reform, access to voting. When does that get hijacked into some insidious form of voter repression? It also includes the opportunity to question and maybe replace outdated voting systems. If any of you are familiar with ranked choice voting, which is, I think, slowly but surely making its way into the consciousness and the practice. In places like Pennsylvania, it also includes opening primary elections to independent voters. Unlike maybe a lot of your states, we forbid independent voters from voting in primary elections, which are almost always, and sadly, the most important elections. And we've got about 1.5 million voters in Pennsylvania who are shut out of the process. with I think great harmful consequences for the way we make choices at election time. These reforms also include redistricting reform, which I mentioned is the focus of our Drawing Lines effort. Because it's timely and kind of unbelievably comprehensive, I'll just stop and say a word about HR 1, the For the People Act that has now passed Congress, which addresses a lot of these issues. It addresses redistricting reform. It doesn't address open primaries, but there's a whole host of things in there: campaign finance reporting, ethics reform, basic issues of voter registration, use of voter ID, so forth and so on. It's if it makes its way through the process, and that's a big if, it'll be the single biggest package of voting and election and democracy reforms, maybe since the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act in the mid-'60s. So call it almost 50 years. I have to say, I have a couple of questions about HR 1, the For the People Act. First of all, and I was just Googling around on this, it isn't clear whether it will pass constitutional muster. The Constitution says the Congress gives the power to regulate voting to the states, and a lot of people remember that part, but then it also says, unless Congress changes its mind, essentially. So it's reserving the power of Congress to make changes, which are then supposed to be executed by the states, given local circumstances and so forth. So the jury seems to be out literally on whether it will pass constitutional muster. I'm a little bit concerned about over-nationalizing elections. I think folks who study election security recognize that the very quirky disparities that we use to run elections across states and across counties actually works to our literal defense against cybersecurity or other kinds of tampering. It's the same logic as to how the internet was built. It's kind of a distributed system that makes it very hard to sort of bring down. I guess as part of that, I am mindful of the fact and supportive of the fact that there's also strength in our federal system, that recognizing that really county governments run elections, and then state governments with the guidance of state governments, that there is value to that in terms of giving people a sense of agency and a sense of how they can make changes at the local or state level. Having said, and the other thing that I just think is a problem is I really believe that changes to the voting process need to be done in some kind of a bipartisan process, because if they're not, it becomes too easy to throw. And you'll see this. A lot of the headlines around HR 1 are saying, this is a Democratic power grab, or they're just trying to get back at us or whatever. And as long as that possibility is out there, and you could say, well, why don't the Republicans step up and vote for it? That's a good question. But, these are the tribal times in which we live. I'm just concerned that if that passes, and it would probably have to pass on a straight party basis in the Senate, then it makes worse this sort of sense of tribalism that is already afflicting us. So if I could have waved a magic wand, I might have said, let's create some sort of a bipartisan commission that would then develop the draft legislation that would have some greater chance of picking up at least a few votes along the way. I personally give HR 1, the For the People Act, kind of a qualified thumbs up. I think a lot of the things particularly around redistricting, it would require states to use independent commissions to do redistricting and agreed upon standards by which they could draw maps. I'm in full support of that because we've seen the consequences of how bad that can get. and how dangerous what dangers it brings to our democracy. But if it doesn't pass, or if it doesn't, if it doesn't pass muster constitutionally, the game is not over. Then what we do is we go back to the state by state efforts to do what we can to make the process better. And so that, sort of brings us back to Pennsylvania. I mentioned some of the things that we've been on: opening up primaries, redistricting reform. I saw a couple head nods around ranked choice voting. We are paying careful attention to that. Some of you know, but if you don't know about ranked choice voting, go to fairvote.org is the national sort of repository of work on that. But it's a very interesting way of voting that encourages candidates to reach out past the white hot core of their support, to reach past their base, as they say in political terms, and to appeal to voters for whom they might be a second or third choice in the interest of gaining a majority of voters. Hold on a sec, I have to let my dog out. What? Because you see, the postman just came by and he gives them treats every day, and they get very upset if I prevent them from having their daily treats. So, the premise of ranked choice voting is that it requires any candidate running for office to secure at least 50% plus one of the total votes cast. And one of the concerns that a lot of folks, including we have, is that too many elections now are won by sort of a plurality of the minority. If you get a 20% turnout in a local election and there's 15 candidates on the ballot, and all you have to do is get the most votes of those 15 candidates, you could get elected, particularly given how important primary elections are, you could get elected with 13% of the vote, which seems like a bad and undemocratic practice, and also causes problems for governing, because once you get elected to city council or the state house or whatever, you know that you were elected by a very small, probably intense slice of the electorate, and that's a problem. So all eyes are on New York City, which is using ranked choice voting for its mayoral and other municipal elections in June. I think there are about 30 candidates running for mayor on the Democratic ticket. And the winner's going to emerge from that process as the one who got 50% plus one of all the votes cast, which is got to be a much better alternative than, getting 1/31st of the votes cast, which is what you were liable to if you didn't have ranked choice voting. So, and some of you may know also, just this last fall, the city of St. Louis passed another voting reform that's called approval voting, which is a variation on the theme of ranked choice voting. But if St. Louis is a more relevant example, you can pay attention to that and not pay attention in New York. So anyway, and this is just a reminder, by the way, that, again, one advantage of this distributed voting system is it allows these kind of local initiatives, these local experiments to bubble up and give people a chance to consider them at a very local level and sort of play out how they work. So that's what I want to say about structural reform and some of the needs to change the rules of the game, because you come to appreciate after a while, the rules of the game have an enormous influence on the outcomes, not just in terms of who gets elected, but the incentives that they carry with them, the political incentives when they carry with them to govern. And I have to let my dog back in just a second. Come on. Looks like he had a treat. So, okay. So So the last lap here is just a couple of observations about how all of the above fits into this challenge of reinforcing the need for more effective, more responsive governing. You know, as I said at the outset, politics has become such a spectacle, and particularly we're reminded of that in this presidential election. When I saw this number, the presidential campaign, both the campaigns themselves and the super PACs that supported them, raised and spent over $14 billion. $14 billion in the run-up to 2020. And one could say, for what exactly? To end up with a deeply divided country and a near insurrection in Washington and so forth and so on. But the larger point is, you know, governing is not about elections. There used to be, actually, Andrew Cuomo's father, Mario Cuomo, famously said once that that the way he saw it, that you campaigned in poetry and governed in prose, which is to say they're different. They're different. That governing is a more serious, more methodical, more structured business. It's not about how many Twitter followers you can amass or what outrage you can spew across social media and so forth. So, and the governing is in great peril right now. I think both in state houses and in Congress and even locally, that we are getting into the habit of electing people based on what they say and what they say they'd like to do, rather than, you know, a more thoughtful consideration of what they have done and therefore what are they likely to do. You know, elections are job interviews. And I don't know about you, but I've never been to a job interview where all they do is ask me about what I believe and what I'd sort of like to do in the future. There's a lot of consideration about, you know, what did you do in this job and that job and what you do in school and so forth and so on. And I'm hopeful. I mean, we can do right now is to sort of try to raise that question and further that expectation. That running for office is not just about, you know, who can spin the most inspiring talk. That it has to have something to do with your ability to do something, and that's particularly true at the local level because the consequences are evident. You know, when you have a trash-filled, graffiti-strewn, graffiti-marked streets, it's clear that like something's broken, and you know there used to be that line that there's no Republican way or Democratic way to fill a pothole. And I'd like to bring that back. That some part of this process is just, it's got to be about competence and about ability to get stuff done. By the way, what is this vaccine distribution other than basic line them up and knock them down, see how many shots you can put in how many arms in a given day? That's all it is. And I hope maybe this experience will recalibrate people's thoughts about politics and governing, and remind them that it's, you know, there's serious issues at stake if we fail to govern effectively and responsibly. So I don't have any magic formula for making that pendulum swing back, but as I said, all we can do is sort of continue to repeat and encourage that kind of thinking. Just a couple concluding thoughts. I was remembering on your specific topic of encouraging college students to get involved and vote, if you haven't come across it, a book that was very influential to me called Taking Back the Vote by a woman named Jane Eisner, who actually Lauren Christella worked with at the National Constitution Center. She basically took a year off from her job and talked to a lot of college students about what it would take to get them engaged in the process. And I'll just give you her sort of 3 takeaways, some of which actually reflect on things I'm already talking about. One is you got to make it easier. This whole concept, we learned this in absentee ballots, that there's this thing called an envelope and a stamp and a post box that you have to use in order to deliver your vote is, as you know, kind of a non sequitur to a lot of college students. So you got to make it easier. You got to make it meaningful, that it matters. You know, back to my, you know, there's a basketball hoop without a net on it. That's some breakdown in the political and governing process that you can influence. And then you got to make it social. You got to make voting, you got to remind people that it's not an individual act. It's not like, and this is some consequence of the fact that we vote in private, behind a screen, it's a library, but it's an act of belonging to our democracy. And Jane in particular said, wouldn't it be cool if we celebrated voting as a rite of passage, the way we celebrate other rites of passage in a religious context, or you know, getting your driver's license or stuff like that. So take a look at the book, file it away for future use. And then the last thing, also in the way of resources on this topic, there was a great website that I think was developed by one of the Portland area universities. It goes back about 5 or 6 years before the last presidential election. That's called whovotes4mayor.org. And it looks at, for about 50 cities, the percentage of young people coming out to vote as opposed to the percentage of old people. And it basically makes the case that old people drive local elections. So as I said to one group, I spoke at community college a few months back. I said, look, here's the deal. If you're happy with your grandparents choosing the next mayor or your city council person or whatever, then keep on keeping on. If you're not, however, you might want to think about not only voting yourself, but engaging some more folks. Because the good thing about life at the local level is, I saw your great video about how elections can be decided by few votes. That's painfully and abundantly true at a local level. You don't have to get lost in the 150 million votes cast at a presidential election. Like, plenty of examples of, you know, a handful of votes deciding elections. So anyway, I just point you to that Who Votes for Mayor and the kind of thinking that lies behind that. So let me stop there. About 15 minutes. If you all want to ask questions, I guess you can ask them in the chat, or just, you know, raise your hand, virtual or otherwise, and let me know what you want to talk about.